Hello and welcome to The New Normal, a series of virtual discussions intended to help us get out of our comfort zones and debate different perspectives of the future while meeting some amazing people. My name is Todd Terrazas and I'm your host. On this episode, we have Katya Klinova sharing her work on the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative at Partnership on AI. What's the role of the AI industry in ensuring AI advances broadly shared prosperity? So Katya Klinova leads AI, labor, and economy research programs at the Partnerships on AI, focusing on studying the mechanisms for steering AI progress towards greater equality of opportunity, improving the working conditions along the AI supply chain. Katya's graduate research focused on examining the potential impact of AI advancement on the economic growth prospects of developing countries. She worked at the UN Executive Office of the Secretary General, preparing the launch of the SG's strategy for new technology, and at Google in a variety of managerial roles in Chrome, Search, Play, and developer relations departments. Katya holds an MPA in International Development from Harvard University and an MSc Master's in Science in Networks and Data Science from University of Riga, and Bachelor of Science in Applied Mathematics and Computer Science from Rostov State University in Russia. Following her talk, we will go into breakout rooms for 25 minutes. Afterwards, we will return to this main room for open discussion. If you're watching this episode on Facebook, you can join us on Zoom by visiting thenewnormalseries.com. Now, without further ado, here's Katya.
Thank you very much, Todd. Thank you everyone for being here. Let me share my screen. All right, I hope you can see that. Let me know if not. Thank you very much again for joining me to talk about the prosperity that AI is generating and is about to generate and how that is being shared. I'm going to start by introducing the Partnership on AI to you, as I'm guessing some of you might not be familiar with it. PI is a coalition of over 100 organizations, nonprofits, AI industry, and academic institutions, all of them coming together to debate and research how do we make sure that AI is bringing about a future that is more just, equitable, and prosperous. In other words, we're thinking about what does it mean in practice to develop and deploy AI in accordance with responsible AI principles that many organizations have adopted in the last few years. I'm sure that some of you have seen probably a number of such sets of principles. One of the first sets was from Asilomar. And they have a principle that states the following, I quote, "The economic prosperity created by AI should be shared broadly to benefit all of humanity," end quote. A lot of organizations have adopted a version of this principle, maybe worded a little bit differently. In the next hour, I want you to join me in thinking about what does it mean to actually implement this in practice. So if you are an AI company or an AI startup and you've adopted a version of principle like this, what does actually change in your operation, in how you think about which products you develop and which products you put out into the world? And actually, if we were talking a few years ago, up until very recently, the mainstream economic thinking that was dominating the economics profession would tell you that you don't really need to change that much. As an innovator, you need to just focus on innovating, disrupt what you need to disrupt, because we know, and we knew then, for technological progress to be the main driver of increasing productivity. And the productivity growth was this tide that we used to say lifts all boats, so economically benefits everyone. In the recent years, though, there is an emerging thinking in the economics profession that starts to differentiate and starts to examine whether it's indeed all kinds of technological progress that are likely to lift all boats, and maybe there are some that are actually more likely to serve a concentration of gains, of income prospects, earning opportunities, economic opportunities, and ultimately they are likely to increase inequality. I'm going to introduce some of this economic thinking to you first, and then talk about how we use it, how we apply it in the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative that I lead at the Partnership on AI. I want to start by saying that it is not always easy, and usually it's not clear at all when you're looking at a piece of technology or the concept to differentiate and predict exactly what the economic impact from it is going to be. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. And let me start by giving you an example here. So this is a phenomenal piece of technology. This is an AI-powered self-order kiosk. Works like magic. You punch some buttons, food appears. Probably it was launched with a campaign, future is here, or something along those lines. Now, if it was deployed, then probably it saves the company some costs. So it probably does generate some prosperity. Is it a shared prosperity? Does this technology benefit all of society? Would your assessment of that question change if I told you that this is a picture not from the US, it's a picture from South Africa, and that unemployment rate in South Africa at the time when this picture was taken last year, so pre-COVID even, was just south of 30%. So South Africa, just like many developing countries, faces a dire need for formal sector jobs. What about these people who need these jobs? And how low can they push their wages to still compete with a technology that respects no borders or knows no borders? Because once a company made an investment in Silicon Valley and bought a startup developing this technology, it becomes very, the marginal cost of deploying it all around the world becomes near zero or negligible. So workers around the world simply would not and cannot compete, and this is what we're seeing, that this is marching around the world. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, well, but hasn't it been always the case that technology has displaced some human jobs, some human tasks, but it also created new ones. So people whose jobs are getting displaced can just transition to doing something else, something different. And indeed, this has been the case. And everything would be well with that story if the pace of automating human tasks and creating new ones always matched in relative speed. Now, what I'm showing you on the slide are graphs from a paper by Darona Chimolu and Pasquale Restrepo from last year. And they're showing that indeed the pace of reinstatement of new tasks for humans and the pace of displacement of those tasks have been matching more or less in the 4 decades following World War II. But then as computer age came about, something has changed dramatically, and what we're seeing is that displacement of tasks is outpacing reinstatement quite a bit, both in manufacturing and overall in the economy. Now, for people to be able to move from jobs that are getting displaced to doing something new, what also needs to happen is that not just that the volume of those new tasks matches the volume of tasks getting displaced, but that the newly created tasks cater to the same kind of skills. Because if they are requiring much higher levels of educational attainment from people, that can be an issue, and that can be deepening inequality, especially in countries where access to education is correlated with income of parents and with wealth, like it is in the US. And so what we have been seeing actually is an evidence of that, because this graph shows you that the demand for labor of people with advanced degrees has been going up and up and up very confidently, while the demand for labor of people without college degrees has been dropping. And one of the reasons of that is believed to be what is called skill bias technological change. So the kind of technological change that advantages people with certain kinds of elite education. Now, what do we do about this? We started the AI and Shared Prosperity Initiative to shift the expectation and shift the paradigm from giving innovators a free pass at disrupting how the market values human labor in any way they please, and essentially leaving it up to society, up to the workers and governments to adjust to these changes, to putting some of this burden back on the AI industry and asking a question, how can the trajectory of AI be adjusted instead to create opportunities for people without asking them to go get a different degree, go get a data science degree, and to be indeed fulfilling this promise of lifting all boats and not just some boats while leaving everybody else behind. But of course, for the AI industry to meaningfully act on this responsibility, they need a practical way to go about this. They need a practical framework to think about the likely impacts of the technology that they're introducing. And as I already illustrated to you, that the impact is not always very obvious and is not always certain. So what does it mean to have a practical framework like this? Let me give you an example with environmentally responsible business. 50, 60 years ago, there was no societal expectation around businesses to be environmentally responsible. A company could have been dumping toxic waste into our rivers or the atmosphere, and nobody would be asking any questions like this. Today, not only do we expect companies to be approaching such externalities responsibly, but there is actually a whole infrastructure for them to be acting on that responsibility. It is very clear what kind of goals we want them to set. That is probably something around emission reduction or getting to zero emissions. It is clear how to measure whether they're making progress towards that goal. That's measuring the emissions. We've learned how to do that as society. And there are very clear policies that companies can adopt to actually make that progress. And that probably has something to do with waste management, energy management, and others. Now, for AI and economic impact of AI and AI development that is mindful of the redistributive impacts that it brings into society, none of this exists. So we don't quite know what is the right goal to set, how do we measure if a company is making progress towards that, and what are the concrete frameworks and approaches a company can adopt to be making that progress. And all of that is what the AI and Shared Prosperity initiative is building with the help of our partners. Now, what happens if we don't do it? If we don't do it, we're gonna continue dedicating the world's scarcest resources, entrepreneurial talent, engineering talent, scientific talent, to developing kinds of innovation that economize on what is very abundant in the world, which is labor, and especially lower and medium skilled labor. And it is not just a wasted innovation and just an unfortunate situation, because we could be developing something that is actually scarce in the world, but it is also potentially increasing dramatically our risks of deepening inequality around the world and within countries as well. But I want to leave you with something optimistic. Smart choices can be made about where technology goes, and we can be making these informed choices about what is beneficial for societies and what is needed and where we'd like the most talented resources to be deployed. So the question that I would love for us to discuss in breakout rooms today is, what are these smart choices that we could be making today and should be making today about the path of AI progress to ensure that it does indeed serve to advance globally shared prosperity. Thank you very much. You can connect with me on Twitter to follow the initiative. You can sign up for our mailing list at the URL that is on the screen right now, and we'll also ping it in the chat. And I want to, for those of you who want to follow the economics profession thinking on this and read up more, these are some of the great people whose ideas I've been quoting on these slides and whose ideas are being actively used in the AI and Shared Prosperity initiative. So thank you very much again. Let me flip back to the breakout session slide, and I'll turn it over to Todd to send us off to the breakout rooms.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Katya. And now we're going to the breakout rooms. So here we go. All right. Hey, Sean. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, what's up?
Hey,
That was a
B.
good breakout.
Awesome. Katya, how was your breakout room?
It was great. We had a great discussion with Sean and Catherine. Thank you both.
Nice. Well, this is the time if anyone has open question or open comments.
I'm curious what. Oh, go ahead.
I'm curious what Katya's perspective is on this, or what your answer to your own question is.
That's a I love that you're turning it back on me. This is what the initiative is about in many ways, and the whole intention for us to actually attract as many voices as possible who would be having different perspective on this. So it's not just Katya's and B's, and I want to take a moment to introduce my colleague B, who's a critical part of this work and this initiative. B, thank you for being here. So it's not in the question, in the answer is not just, Katya's and B's thoughts on this, but a lot of people, and having events like this is just phenomenal because I get to hear from all of you, and maybe I would not have ever met you in some other circumstances of my life. But if we're just concentrating for a second on what I think about it, we are realizing that there is a lot in the question of whether prosperity is going to be shared or not. A lot depends on whether the technology that we're developing with AI and the kinds of applications that we're using AI to create are labor using or labor saving. And in some sense, the question of sharing prosperity becomes isomorphic to the question of whether we're creating technology that is boosting the demand for labor, and especially for labor of people without college degrees, or if we are reducing the demand for labor. And when we're reducing the demand for labor, we're reducing wages as well, even if we're not directly displacing jobs, and the number of jobs doesn't go down. So that is a very important part of that equation. There is also, I need to also address that there could be a strategy of let's just let AI go the path, whatever path it takes, and maybe that's a labor saving path, and allow it to generate a lot of gains, and then redistribute those gains exposed in the form of UBI or something like that. But that does run into a few issues, and I'm not anti-UBI. I think we should do that in addition to also thinking about how to direct the path of technology. But the few issues to keep in mind there is that if we just rely on redistribution exposed, it is an inherently fragile system, because if you have fewer and fewer people and organizations that further and further concentrate gains, they become increasingly powerful. And what's the motivation for them to keep redistributing out generation after generation after generation? And also right now, there are no cross-border, so international mechanisms for redistributing something like UBI or tax revenues, right? So what about the workers in South Africa that we were talking about? Who's gonna send UBI to them? And that's probably not gonna be a company based here.
Something that our breakout touched on was kind of like different types of prosperity or different types of well-being or things that people should take into consideration. Like we kind of zoomed out and we're talking about other questions of shared prosperity or kind of like redistributive questions. Like I think it was Jeff who brought up kind of our challenge already, even if we're not talking about high-tech things of making sure that everyone gets enough food and that we don't that we have this surplus of food and yet it doesn't necessarily get to the people who need it, or a lot of it goes to waste. And I think that as we're thinking about, if we're going to employ some sort of redistributive mechanism, I think that in some ways that's kind of telling, how challenging it is to kind of distribute after the fact. And part of why I see it as so valuable to think about how we can try to, there's this phrase of like pre-distribution, try to like incline the development of technology to not create those massive imbalances that then need redistribution, but instead try to create technologies that are themselves redistributive. And one of the things that I used as an example is like in the disability activism space, there are a lot of people who would like to enter the workforce, but can't, either because of like different rules or because of the access needs that they have to do the work. And I think that in many ways, like it feels like AI should be like, oh, wow, it's going to be this amazing thing that we can have all these personalized interfaces and everyone can have their accessibility needs met. But that's not necessarily what we actually see in practice. And so that's a space where I think technologists, like if we could inspire more technologists to think about how to make beginning work easier rather than trying to automate away what might be like beginning or entry level work, then that's like a real space for opportunity, especially when it comes to people who've historically been kind of excluded from the workforce.
100%.
It just seems like, the productivity gains of companies through AI and the displacement of employees and workers and whatnot needs to be offset by a UBI, but like a UBI then is a government providing those funds, and so hence you've got a taxation problem, right? So it's all about taxing corporations and not allowing them to evade taxes like Apple and Microsoft and Google and every tech company that exists. How much does corporate taxation play into all of this?
If we're relying on redistribution, at least partially, taxation has this major role that you're outlining exactly. And right now, because technologies are getting deployed all over the world, we are running into the question of global taxation, right? And right now, some of you might be familiar with all the schemes around, where you locate your headquarters, where you choose to pay your taxes. So the taxes you're paying are not necessarily proportional to the revenues that you're making in each of the countries. Or even if they are, some of the poorer countries that might not be generating as much revenues might actually be in a more dire need of that UBI because their jobs might be going away faster or the wages are getting impacted more. So there is this disbalance that you're pointing out, which is a big question. And this is one of the caveats when we think about UBI 100%.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about, the displacement of workers and income tax going away along with it, and along with all the other taxation issues. It's just, a feedback loop. Negative.
I see a question in the chat about would the marginal cost of things necessarily go down as AGI become a standard way of interaction? How would the best practice in redistribution be ensured geographically and demographically? Okay, these are two questions. Would the marginal cost of things necessarily go down? The marginal cost of things might go down quite a bit. We don't know yet, right? Like because AGI, we don't know yet exactly how AGI can materialize, but that doesn't mean that consumer prices would go down because in a competitive market, when you're dropping your costs, when your costs are dropping, then you want to be dropping your price to compete. But if you don't have that many competitors, if you are a monopoly, then you can be cutting your costs, but you don't necessarily have to reflect it in the price that you are putting out to consumers, right? Like you can still keep the price where it was and just pocket the difference. And this is actually the danger of concentration of that power, and the question of who is going to own AGI. Is it going to be a monopoly that owns AGI? And how would we ensure best practice in redistribution geographically and demographically? Very difficult question. I don't think we have a precedent of like a good practice. We don't even have any kind of global redistribution scheme. The only one that exists is development aid and humanitarian aid, and people in the field know all kinds of issues with that. And right now it is much smaller than what developing countries actually need to combat poverty. So it's just not enough. We don't have a good practice, so we don't have a best practice either. And this is why it is important to think about the pre-distribution that Bea was talking about. How do we direct technology so we don't have to rely as much on a redistributional scheme? Even though, again, I do think that we should be thinking about what would a good redistributional scheme look like, and we should use that instrument. It just would serve us well to not rely solely on that.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of going off of what Bea said earlier, and this whole idea of, I guess, I feel like as we grow and as technology grows, I feel like the whole maybe sci-fi idea is like of a utopia where no one has to work, right? And maybe that's where the rich, maybe that's why we're going the way we're going. And I just wonder if, like Bea mentioned, with all this as technology gets better and we have all these devices at home, and with Starlink and Elon Musk bringing the internet to everybody, I wonder if maybe our ideals get more away from labor that brings us money and more of like giving or anything to like these devices becoming normal at-home things that allow you to be self-sustaining and don't have to work because you have these things that technology has brought to the globe, and then it doesn't have to be a part of a government thing. Yeah, because that is a problem.
I think the dream of a world in which nobody has to work and people can just do the kind of activities that bring them joy and fulfillment, and have them express their creative potential. I think that's a beautiful idea. The only thing that we are observing right now is that people who are creating technology that sort of enables that, they are moving much faster than societal institutions and policy institutions that would allow for robust redistribution, that would actually not leave people behind, but lift people up to that level in which they don't have to work. They can work if they choose on their creative pursuits or something else, caring for their loved ones, and they would still be provided to do all of that. Right now, we don't have those institutions that can assure us in that, but we're already moving full steam ahead with the technology that is automating human labor. And sorry, go ahead.
I think it was and more of envisioning not people sitting around all day on their computers, more of like valuing the idea of creating your own food, or and finding joy in that, because I think that a lot of people, even you read books about people who have wealth and nothing to do, and that brings depression. So I think like maybe there is something of value in bringing the opportunity to sustain yourself, not by just sitting around all day and having things brought to you, but by allowing you to freely, without any monetary problems, be able to sustain for yourself.
That's very interesting. I also I do think that it's important to allow for people to choose, right? Like whether they want to be having that lifestyle or they want to just focus on, maybe being an artist and making paintings all day and not worry about growing their own food. And having robots earn their living.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it's almost the hour. So I just wanted to thank you again, Katya, for joining us today on the new normal. And thank you everyone else for also participating. I think our next new normal will be after our Life Summit. So right now we're busy, gearing up for our Life Summit to be on October 13th through 15th. So hope that you will all show up. Go to lifesummit.la. And then we'll have return with the new normal, I think last week of October. And so you'll all find out more about that shortly. But enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all. And be well and be happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
See ya.